Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. If you enjoy calm, immersive history that helps you relax while learning something profound about humanity, consider liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing to History for Sleep. Your support allows these long journeys through the past to continue. Tonight, we're exploring one of the strangest and most misunderstood decisions humanity has ever made. A decision not to build higher, not to expand outward, not to conquer, but to bury an entire city on purpose. Not destroyed by war, not lost to disaster, not erased by time. Buried, carefully, deliberately, layer by layer. Across history, cities usually vanish through violence or neglect. They burn, they collapse, they decay. But there are rare moments when people chose something else. They sealed their homes, covered their streets, and walked away, leaving behind a silent message written into the earth itself. To understand why a civilization would do this, we must step into a mindset very different from our own. For ancient people, a city was not just a place to live. It was a living entity, a spiritual structure, a shared memory. Ending a city was not failure. Sometimes it was completion. One of the clearest examples comes from a place that remained hidden beneath the ground for thousands of years. A place where homes had no doors, where people entered through the roof, where generations lived atop one another, quite literally. This was Çatalhöyük. Located in what is now modern-day Turkey, Çatalhöyük was one of the earliest large human settlements ever discovered. It existed long before kings, before writing, before formal religion as we recognize it today. People lived here around 9,000 years ago. They farmed. They hunted. They painted their walls with images of animals, rituals, and symbols we still struggle to fully interpret. But what makes Çatalhöyük truly unusual is not how it began. It's how it ended. Over centuries, the people of this city repeatedly buried their own homes. When a house reached the end of its life, they didn't abandon it to crumble. They filled it in, sealed it, and built a new home directly on top. This happened again and again, until the city became a mound, layer upon layer of lived-in memory. This was not accidental. Archaeologists found no signs of panic or destruction, no mass graves, no sudden collapse. Instead, they found order. The dead were buried beneath the floors of homes. Ancestors remained present, physically and spiritually. Living families slept above those who came before them. When it was time to move on, the city wasn't erased. It was entombed. This raises an unsettling question. Why would people preserve a place by burying it rather than letting it fade? One explanation is ritual closure. In many ancient cultures, places had lifespans just like people. A home could be born, used, honored, and then laid to rest. Burying a structure was an act of respect, a way to prevent spiritual contamination, a way to seal energy, memory, or meaning. Another theory suggests something even deeper, that these people understood permanence differently. They didn't believe a city needed to exist forever to be meaningful. They believed meaning came from cycles: birth, burial, renewal. But Çatalhöyük is not the only place where this occurred. Across the ancient world, there are cities that appear to have been intentionally covered, closed, or ritually abandoned. In the Indus Valley, entire urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro show signs of orderly departure. No evidence of invasion. No widespread violence. Just quiet leaving. Some streets were deliberately blocked. Certain buildings sealed. Water systems shut down carefully, as if the city was being put to sleep. This has led to countless theories. Some suggest environmental changes forced people to leave. Rivers shifting, soil exhaustion, climate shifts. These explanations are reasonable, but they don't fully explain the care taken in abandonment. Others believe these cities were closed due to spiritual beliefs. Perhaps leaders believed the land had become impure. Perhaps the gods demanded withdrawal. Perhaps the city had fulfilled its purpose. And then there are the conspiracies. Some believe ancient people discovered something beneath these cities. Something dangerous. something they chose to seal away. This idea appears again and again in myths, stories of forbidden knowledge, places where humans dug too deep, warnings about what lies below. There is no evidence of advanced lost technology hidden beneath these cities. No ancient machines waiting to be rediscovered. But there is evidence of fear. Not panic, but reverence. Ancient people often buried things they respected or feared. Weapons, sacred objects, places associated with death or power. To bury something was not to forget it. It was to acknowledge its significance. Another possibility is psychological. Cities are not just physical spaces. They shape identity. When societies change rapidly, old cities can become symbols of an outdated world. Burying them becomes a way to mark transition. A clean ending. A deliberate line between what was and what will be. In this sense, burying a city is not an escape. It is a statement. We are done here. And that is okay. This idea challenges modern thinking. Today we preserve ruins. We freeze cities in time. We struggle to let places die. Ancient people were often more comfortable with endings. They understood that continuity does not require permanence. Memory can survive without structure. As the night continues, we'll explore other buried cities, strange abandonment rituals, misunderstood archaeological evidence, and the deeper human instinct behind sealing places away, not because they were forgotten, but because they mattered. As we move deeper into this story, it becomes important to slow down and truly understand what burial meant to ancient people, because it did not carry the same emotional weight it does today. For us, burial often suggests loss, fear, or finality. For them, it was frequently associated with care, continuity, and balance. In many early societies, the ground itself was seen as a living boundary between worlds. What went into the earth was not gone. It was transferred, returned, placed back into a cycle that would eventually give rise to something new. This worldview helps explain why entire neighborhoods were sometimes sealed rather than dismantled. Breaking something apart was seen as violent. Covering it gently was respectful. At Catalhoyuk, archaeologists found that walls were often plastered again and again before burial, as if the residents were smoothing the surface one last time. Floors were carefully leveled. Openings were closed. There was no sense of urgency. It feels less like abandonment and more like a farewell. This pattern appears again when we look at ancient Jericho, one of the oldest continuously occupied sites on Earth. Jericho has been destroyed and rebuilt many times, but there are layers where the city seems intentionally reset. Walls were filled in, structures covered. New life emerged on top of the old without erasing it. Each layer is a conversation between generations. The people who built above knew what lay below. They were not ignorant of the past. They were standing on it quite literally. This challenges the idea that ancient people lacked long-term planning or historical awareness. In reality, they were deeply aware of time. They simply interacted with it differently. They did not try to preserve cities as monuments. They allowed them to become foundations. In the Indus Valley, this philosophy becomes even more intriguing. Mohenjo-Daro was one of the most advanced cities of its time, with precise grid layouts, standardized bricks, and sophisticated drainage systems. Yet at some point its population declined. People left, and the city fell silent. There is no clear evidence of invasion, no signs of widespread destruction. Instead, there is order. This has led some researchers to suggest that the city was not abandoned in crisis, but in response to long-term change. Perhaps the river shifted. Perhaps trade routes evolved. Perhaps the culture itself transformed. But again, we see deliberate closure. Certain public spaces appear to have been intentionally blocked. Infrastructure was shut down methodically. It feels less like collapse and more like conclusion. And this idea appears again and again across continents. In the Americas, some ancient mound-building cultures buried ceremonial centers beneath layers of earth. These mounds were not random piles of soil. They were engineered, planned, constructed with precision. Each layer represented a phase of use. When one phase ended, it was covered and another began. The site was not abandoned. It was transformed. This brings us to a difficult realization. Ancient people were not always trying to preserve the past. Sometimes they were trying to contain it. Memory can be powerful. Too powerful. Cities accumulate meaning. They carry trauma. They hold rituals, deaths, conflicts, and beliefs. At some point, a society may decide that a place has absorbed enough, that continuing to live there would disturb balance. In these cases, burial becomes a form of protection, not just for the city but for the people who move on. There are myths that echo this idea. Stories of cursed places, sacred grounds that must not be disturbed, cities sealed because something went wrong. These myths are often dismissed as superstition, but they may reflect real emotional decisions made by real communities. Imagine living in a city where generations of your ancestors are buried beneath your feet, where rituals have been performed for centuries, where memories are layered into the walls. Leaving such a place would not be simple. You would not want to tear it apart. You would want to leave it intact. Some conspiratorial theories suggest that ancient cities were buried to hide advanced knowledge or technology. While there is no credible evidence for lost machines or forgotten sciences beyond what archaeology has already revealed, these theories persist for a reason. They express a feeling that something important was deliberately left behind. And in a sense, that feeling is correct. What was left behind was not technology but meaning. Buried cities are messages without words. They tell us that not everything is meant to last forever. That progress does not always mean expansion. That sometimes the most responsible act is to stop. This idea is uncomfortable for modern societies. We build upward, outward, relentlessly. We rarely choose to end a city gracefully. Ancient people did, and they did so with intention. As we continue, we'll explore more examples of cities sealed, covered, or carefully deserted, and we'll examine what these decisions reveal about how early humans understood time, identity, and responsibility, not as conquerors of the land, but as temporary guests upon it. As this pattern repeats across cultures and continents, it becomes clear that burying a city was not an isolated behavior. It was part of a broader human instinct. An instinct to mark endings with intention rather than chaos. To truly understand this, we need to move away from the idea that ancient people were simply reacting to events. They were often anticipating them. Many early societies believed that imbalance accumulated over time. Not just environmental imbalance, but spiritual and social imbalance as well. A city that grew too dense, too complex, or too disconnected from nature could be seen as unstable. In those cases, leaving was not failure. It was wisdom. One of the most striking aspects of intentionally buried cities is how little personal property was taken. In some sites, valuable items were left behind. Tools, decorations, even food storage vessels. This suggests that people did not flee. They chose. And that choice required consensus. Entire communities agreed to walk away. That alone tells us something profound about social cohesion in ancient times. Decisions were not always imposed by rulers or elites. They were shared understandings. This becomes especially clear when we examine ritual abandonment. In some cultures, before a settlement was sealed, ceremonies were performed. Offerings were made. Fires were lit. Spaces were purified. These rituals served a purpose. They transformed a living place into a resting place. The city was no longer active, but it was not dead. It was dormant. This idea appears in many belief systems. The concept that places have energy, that they can become tired, that they need rest. While modern science does not support the idea of exhausted land in a spiritual sense, it does recognize ecological limits. Soil depletion, resource exhaustion, water scarcity. Ancient people may not have used our terminology, but they observed patterns. When the land stopped giving back, they listened. Another factor that cannot be ignored is generational change. Cities are shaped by traditions. but traditions can become restrictive. At some point, younger generations may no longer identify with the place their ancestors built. They may seek a fresh beginning. But leaving does not require erasure. Burying a city allows a culture to honor its past without being trapped by it. This perspective helps explain why some sites show evidence of careful documentation before abandonment. Symbols repeated, patterns reinforced, stories embedded into walls and floors. The city became a record, not written in text but in structure. There is also a psychological comfort in sealing something away rather than watching it decay. Abandonment without closure can feel unresolved. Burial provides finality. This instinct still exists today. We hold funerals. We mark endings. We create rituals around loss. Ancient cities were no different. What changes is scale. When an entire city is buried, the act becomes monumental. But the emotion behind it is familiar. Respect, care, acceptance. This perspective challenges the idea that ancient people feared the future more than we do. In many ways, they were more comfortable with uncertainty. They accepted impermanence. They understood that survival did not require clinging to structures. It required adaptability. This adaptability may be one of the reasons humanity endured. While some cities were sealed, others rose elsewhere. Knowledge traveled with people. Skills moved. Stories continued. The buried city was not the end of a civilization. It was a chapter break. And like all chapter breaks, it allowed the story to continue. There is something quietly reassuring about this. It suggests that humans have always known when to let go. Not perfectly, not always peacefully, but often thoughtfully. As we move closer to the final understanding of why cities were buried on purpose, one truth becomes clearer than any theory or conspiracy. Ancient people did not see themselves as masters of the land. They saw themselves as participants in a cycle. Build, water, release. This cycle does not dominate nature. It cooperates with it. Perhaps this is the lesson buried cities are still offering us today. Not instructions to abandon our homes, but reminders that permanence is not the measure of success. Meaning can exist without endurance. And sometimes, the most human thing to do is to leave something intact and walk forward. As we approach the final understanding of why humanity sometimes chose to bury its own cities, it helps to step back and look at the pattern as a whole, rather than focusing on any single site, culture, or theory. Across time, geography, and belief systems, the same quiet logic appears again and again. A city is not just a collection of buildings. It is a concentration of human intention. Every wall holds decisions. Every street carries habits. Every structure reflects values that once made sense, but may no longer fit the people who live there. When those values shift, the city can begin to feel heavy. Not physically, emotionally. Ancient people were deeply sensitive to this feeling. They lived closer to the rhythms of land, weather, and seasons. They noticed when balance changed, when resources strained, when social harmony weakened. And rather than forcing permanence, they sometimes chose restraint. To bury a city was to acknowledge that its time had passed. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded. It had served its purpose. This idea reframes burial not as loss but as completion. Much like a finished story does not need additional pages, a finished city does not need to endure forever to matter. There is also something important to understand about memory. Modern societies externalize memory through records, archives, and digital storage. Ancient societies embedded memory into space. The city itself was the archive. By burying it intact, they preserved memory in the most literal way possible. Nothing was erased. Everything was sealed. Future generations were never meant to live there. They were meant to remember it, even if that memory would sleep for thousands of years beneath the soil. This is why buried cities feel so powerful when rediscovered. They are not ruins shaped by chaos. They are moments frozen by choice. The conspiracies surrounding these places often arise from discomfort with that idea. We want dramatic endings. disasters, secrets, hidden catastrophes. But the truth is often quieter. Humanity has always known when to stop. Not always in time. Not without conflict. But often with intention. Burying a city required collective agreement, shared understanding, a willingness to release identity tied to place. That is not weakness. That is maturity. It suggests that ancient societies were not obsessed with growth for its own sake. They valued balance more than expansion. This may be the most difficult lesson for modern audiences to accept. We live in a world that equates success with continuity, with scale, with permanence. Ancient people measured success differently. They measured it by harmony. When harmony ended, they moved on. And they did so without destroying what came before. They honored it. As we bring this long journey to a close, there is no single buried city that holds all the answers. Catalhoyuk shows us ritual closure. Mohenjo-Daro shows us orderly departure. Jericho shows us layered continuity. Mound cultures show us ceremonial renewal. Together they tell one story. Humanity has always understood that not everything is meant to last forever. And that understanding did not weaken us. It sustained us. If this story helped you relax, reflect, or fall asleep while learning something meaningful about our shared past, take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to History for Sleep. Your support makes these long, thoughtful journeys possible. For now, you don't need to hold on to every detail. Let the images fade. Let the cities rest. They have already been preserved, patiently, beneath the ground. And as you drift into sleep, remember this quiet truth the ancient world left for us. Progress does not always mean building more. Sometimes, it means knowing when to gently cover what came before, and walk forward with respect. Sleep well.